Test, test, test. Good morning, everyone. I like to see some more faces in the crowd. It's making me really happy right now. We have another wonderful talk that I'm extremely excited for. It is Rethinking the Sanity Meter, Depicting Mental Health in Games with Emperatriz. Emperatriz is a Chinese-Colombian writer, game designer, and educator from the American Southwest. Her research and creative work predominantly explores themes of mental health and generational trauma. I'd like to welcome Emperatriz.
Hi, everyone. We're trying to figure out where to put the water, sorry. So thank you for coming out today. Thank you, Jordan. Really excited to be here. So today we'll be talking about Rethinking the Sanity Meter, Depicting Mental Health in Games. My name is Emperatriz, and I'm here to talk to you today about the representation of mental health in games, and particularly the sanity meter mechanic, and a little bit of a crash course also on disability studies theory. Ultimately, I'm hoping some of you take away a little bit of how to rethink integration of mental health themes in your projects. Cool, okay. So a little bit of a content warning. This is going to be focused on auditory hallucinations, mental health, and trauma. So, a little bit about me. I'm an independent game creator, and I frequently work on games regarding mental health and trauma. Some of these projects include Edge of Healing, which is about restorative justice, Yumi's Home, which is about depression, and Under Oath, which is currently in development, and it's about testifying in court as a sexual assault survivor. Prior to making games, I was into literature. I was a literary scholar a bit and had some focus on disability studies theory and poetry. There are a growing number of games that explore themes of surviving trauma in both the domestic sphere and war sphere. So there is Papa and Yo by Minority Media Inc. And After Hours, who both that kind of address themes of trauma in the domestic sphere. And then there's games such as This War of Mine and Pry that address trauma both civilian and military in relation to war. So first, I'd like to talk about how trauma, mental health, and disability are connected. They are not interchangeable, but there is both theories of trauma and disability point to the impossibility of a stable or normal body. And so this overlap and connection is where I'm kind of focusing today, this overlap on this embodiment of this inability to kind of achieve what we view as normal. So a bit of a disclaimer first. The definitions I'm giving today are definitely a bit generalized. This is to keep the talk short. I would really encourage you, if you want to know more about disability studies, to look some more up. But there are many models of disability studies, always in conversation with each other. My main goal and motivation in introducing the basic concepts of these models are to give you a sturdier anchor that could help you, guide you when you're designing. How does a character navigate through the world you build? What do the player characters carry within themselves? So again, this is particularly in relation to auditory hallucinations. We'll be looking at both tabletop and digital games. So first definition that we're going to look at is medical model. There's a little bit of this kind of medical model understands disability as a pathology, something that you need to cure, something that is in need of treatment, remediation, rehabilitation, and mitigation. Games often treat mental health as something that you need to be cured of. In the next two examples, sanity is treated as something that is an affliction and aligns a bit with this medicalized model perspective. So this is Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG. It was first published in 1981. I believe this cover is from the second edition from 1983. Historically, a lot of developers and designers how they grappled with representing mental health came a lot from this game. So with the brief amount of time we have, we'll look at this particular mechanic. In Call of Cthulhu, more modern editions refer to the sanity meter and the sanity mechanic as stability. But in the first few editions, I think it was after the 4th edition, but in the first few editions, the sanity meter was referred to as sanity and instead of stability. You can be temporarily or permanently insane in this game, and there are a couple methods of regaining sanity. One, which is psychoanalysis, and one is institutionalization, both to kind of establish a cure rate in the game. So next example is Eternal Darkness. This is a psychological horror game that was developed and published on the GameCube in June 2002. Some of the effects that happen when your sanity meter is low include bleeding walls, distant sounds of many voices screaming or crying, and it reaches a point where your character starts to lose health. Enemies you encounter cause your sanity meter to lower. As a player, you are frequently seeking ways to replenish or return to a normal state through healing spells. So sanity meter mechanics have been used as an attempt to simulate mental health, but these meters don't take into account the lived experience of trauma, dissociation, psychosis, or mania. In these examples, developers have designed games to fit into what I see as this medical model of disability. So next up we have social model. And with social model, so like a more formal definition, it's that the problem of disability is not solved through medical intervention or surgical normalization, but through social change and political transformation. So essentially that the disability is caused by the way that society is constructed. And so these next examples, I think, are like moves that break away from the medicalized model, steps towards that, because chronic conditions are often not cured but managed. And these examples align more with the social model perspective. So this is Unknown Armies, a tabletop RPG, first published in 1998. This expands on the mechanic that was also in Call of Cthulhu. And here it's called the chapter is called Madness. And if your character endures too much stress and passes a particular threshold of tolerance, the game attempts to have the player mimic like the sympathetic nervous system responses to trauma. In Unknown Armies, there are also ways to heal from what they call, quote, getting crazy. And this comes also in the form of a therapeutic modality that repairs damaged shock gauge. And players with only players with a therapeutic attribute can offer a therapy session. And there's like, similar to Call of Cthulhu, there is a kind of a cap at the rate that one can be cured of their mental illness. In a revised version in 2018, the designers also kind of clarify why it's called a section called Missing Madness, and they clarify why schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder aren't included. They say that a great many people have misperceptions about the disorders and they don't want to reinforce any incorrect information. And so in the 3rd edition that's revised in 2016, it's mental trauma instead of madness. So that brings us to Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice from 2017. This screenshot has one of my favorite quotes. It's a voice of Senua's who's like whispering in her ear, and it says, "Another voice joins us. She once tried to make them go away, pretend they weren't real, but what good is that when we are always here?" It's really highlighting like the protagonist's reality. It's something that the player manages with the voices. The player navigates the world rather than getting rid of the hallucinations, the auditory hallucinations. From a personal perspective, Senua's sacrifice was difficult for me to play because of how closely her auditory hallucinations are to my own experiences. She certainly isn't a weak character or a cowardly, but the voices that afflict her accompany her on her journey. So, I guess, yeah, I went really fast. Okay, so I guess my criticism of some games today are that they're more settled into this medicalized model, and it isn't to say that they're bad games or wrong, but it does show how there's a lot left to explore beyond the stigma and fear characters experience with their mental health in the worlds we design. What do these worlds and characters look like when they carry their symptoms with them, not just when they encounter an enemy or monster? How can we get them to have a new purpose beyond plot devices? And so I ultimately want to ask you to consider mental health as part of the character, rather than merely a status ailment, and consider how they are healing or replenishing their mental health and well-being if they are given such a value. And why? It's because players are often with the character most, if not all the time in the game. So I think that having this perspective from disability studies theory opens us up to a more holistic approach, and not only just to representation, but also mechanics, narrative, and art and design. So that was it. Thank you. I don't know if I'm supposed to do questions. Was I supposed? I can do a question. I can do questions. Someone has a question. Yes. I think a lot of people have said more wise things than I have. One would be Cherry Ray Thompson. They did a talk at GDC called "You Can Take an Arrow to the Knee and Still Be an Adventurer." I would highly recommend their talk, covering a lot of how we can combat that. Slightly more, the takeaways are a little bit more in on representation too, but I really recommend that talk. Yeah. Thank you so much.